Hey everyone, hope you've been doing well and staying warm. So I posted a picture online a couple days ago and I've had a lot of people ask me how I actually took this picture. And it's really similar to a picture I've taken, I think it was last spring. And this is the picture right here. There we go, now it's on camera. So this is the picture here. And so I want to make a video kind of walking through how I did this picture, some of the techniques that I used, and why I did some of the things I did with it. So, a little background on this, I used a fisheye lens, and I actually took the picture with my old Canon DSLR, which is about a 10-year-old camera. But that just goes to show you can still get good pictures without having to spend a lot of money on photography gear. And the reason I use that camera, not my new Fujifilm, is because I don't have a fisheye lens for my Fujifilm. I only have one for the Canon, so that's why I still use the Canon camera from time to time. So, without further ado, let's jump into some footage from the lake, and then we'll pick back up here at the computer. So this next shot is in a grove of evergreen trees that are very tall and very close together. So how I'm going to do this shot is actually to recreate a shot I've taken in the past. I took the shot over last spring, I think, right around Easter time. So essentially I'm going to use my fisheye lens, but the camera's going to be sideways in portrait mode. Big old fisheye lens. Alright, let's go. Alrighty, here we are. One of my favorite places at the lake. Look at that though, that's just so beautiful back there. Man. Anyway, I'm going to set you down, turn you around, and you'll be able to actually see me set up for this shot. So how I'm going to take this picture, using a method called HDR. Essentially, I take a series of photos at different brightness levels. For different exposures. After I've taken the series of photos at different exposures, I combine them together in Adobe Lightroom, is the software I use. And then I'm able to get all the detail out of both the shadows and the highlights. Apparently I didn't have my battery seated all the way in my Canon because it just about died on me. That's not good. So let's try this again, round two. Nope, my batteries actually were dead. Made the mistake of not wearing my gloves this whole time. Can't feel my hands. So I think when I get back there, I'm just going to stand for a second with my hands in my pockets, because I have hot hands on there. Okay, so this is actually round 2 of me explaining how to do this because apparently my OBS settings were set wrong the first time and didn't record anything other than just the grid of my photos. So here we go. So how this photo is possible is through a technique called HDR, which stands for High Dynamic Range. And to create a high dynamic range photo, you use a series of photos at different exposures or brightness levels. So if you look across these 6 almost identical photos, the main difference between them all is the brightness. So by shooting the photos at different brightness levels, you retain detail in different parts of the image. So in this darkest image here, you can see all the detail in these areas that are super bright regularly. And in the brightest photo, you see a lot of detail in these areas that are typically very dark. So now to create the HDR photo, we take our set of photos and we go to Photo Merge and we do HDR Merge. And the application I'm using to do all this is Adobe Lightroom Creative Cloud. The full version of Lightroom is fantastic, and I use it primarily for printing, but I typically use Creative Cloud just because I really like its syncability between all the different platforms. So now it's stitched together our photos to give us a preview. I typically don't use auto settings, I do most of my color grading myself, and I'm not going to worry about any of the other settings, and I'm just going to hit Merge. And what's nice is it'll automatically align all the photos in case your camera slightly got bumped during the process. And then automatically puts them into a stack right here. And if I click, it'll give me a number up here in just a second. Okay, so now we have all our pictures merged into one HDR photo. You can see a little number up here. It shows we have 7 pictures in the stack, the 6 original pictures, and then the 1 HDR merged picture. So now that we have all these pictures merged here, what we're able to do is really pull a whole lot of dynamic range out of it. So for starters, I'm going to boost the exposure up a little bit, bring the highlights down, bring our shadows up, and now you can see we have a whole lot of detail in there, although it's still a bit dark. So I'm going to push the whites a little bit, bring my exposure up a little bit more. And the problem we're going to run into is we're going to get some clipping down in this area where the whites are going to be overexposed. So my next step I usually do is add a bit of clarity. That's really going to kind of help the details pop around the edges. I'm going to add a little bit of texture in too. Sometimes I'll add in a little bit of dehaze. This picture doesn't really need it. I'm going to add just a hair in. Now I do want to remove any chromatic aberration. That'll be a little silhouette around edges. Sometimes you'll see a little bit of a colored silhouette. I'm also going to remove just a little bit of fringing, which is a slight purple border around edges you'll see sometimes. Or green, depending on the lens. We can bring our saturation up just a little bit of vibrance. Alright, so this is a good baseline of this photo. I'm not going to go deep into all the individual edits I did on recreating it on here. But what I will do now is show you the original picture. So this is the final picture that I ended up with. Now what I did to get this picture to get here, on top of what I already went over, here you can see my individual light settings. You can see how I brought up the exposure by 2 stops. I brought the contrast to maximum, brought down the highlights, brought up the shadows. And then in the color, I did add a little bit of saturation. I actually didn't increase the vibrance at all in the original edit. And in the color mixer here, I did do a slight bit of color shift on the blues. I shifted them a bit more towards the cyan on the sky to kind of give it a little bit of a cooler look to it. And then over here in the color grading pane, you can see I also did a bit of work. So what I did is I brought the shadows a bit towards the blue hue. I brought in a bit of warmer colors, a bit more in the orange shift in the midtones, and I took the highlights a bit more towards that bluish, cyanish as well, to kind of give it that nice wintry look with a bit of warmth in the trees. And you can see I did quite a bit of clarity, added some texture to it. Didn't add any dehaze in the original one, actually. And I added a bit of sharpening as well. on top of my chromatic aberration removal and defringing. But now if you remember what I said about blowing out the highlights in this area, this is where some of the more fine-tuning edits come in. So I added a couple linear gradients, which let you do adjustments to specific areas. So this first one, you can see I pretty much just did the top part of the photo. And there I brought the highlights down even more and the whites down to really help bring out all the detail in those trees. And the next linear gradient is just the bottom part of the picture. And that one I brought the whites down so I could bring the overall brightness of the picture up without clipping anything. And then this last linear gradient, I actually brought the whites all the way up. So it's kind of a tiered stage there. There are better ways I could have gone about that, but this was the easiest and quickest way to take care of all those adjustments. And then on the cropping page here, I didn't actually do this. This was automatic, but you can see when it aligns the photos, automatically trims out all the extra that wouldn't give you a nice even picture. So that is how I went about creating this picture. Now we'll take it out of Lightroom Creative Cloud and bring it into Lightroom Classic, which is the software that I typically use for printing my pictures out. So before we jump into the whole printing process, I want to talk about paper selection and why I chose this particular paper for printing. So this paper is from a company called Red River Papers, and they're made in America, which is awesome. And the paper is actually called the Palo Duro Baryta Fiber 300. Now what's really cool about this paper is it has a very neat vintage grain to it. So it's kind of like a luster paper where there's a slight texture, a semi-gloss finish to it, but the texture, the grain's actually a little bit elongated, a little bit thicker. And it really brings a lot of richness to the blacks. It really helps the detail shine through. And the paper itself has a nice warmer color temperature to it than some of the other papers that are a little bit cooler. So I love this paper for so many things. It's a bit on the pricier end of papers, but it's very thick. It's made out of a really nice high quality stock. So I use this paper for 90% of my prints. It's awesome. Alright, so now I've got the picture pulled up here in Lightroom Classic. And I could actually do all my edits in Lightroom Classic. It is a bit more powerful of an application than Lightroom Creative Cloud. There's a lot more I can do in it. But I kind of learned in the Creative Cloud version of it. I really like the collaborative and the web tools and being able to sync everything between all my devices. Since there's the Creative Cloud Lightroom apps for iPhone, iPad, and stuff like that. So I've still been doing most of my editing in Lightroom Creative Cloud, and sometimes I'll export to Photoshop when I need to do other types of processes. But we have it here in our library, the picture, and now we're going to go over to the print tool. So I do most of my prints on 8.5 by 11 letter size paper, but I do them for 8 by 10 prints. And that has to do with pricing of paper and availability and stuff like that. So what I want to do, and this is actually fresh, I haven't actually printed from this at all, so this will be a good process of stepping through what I do. So first thing we're going to do is go to our page setup. There's my photo printer. I'm going to change this to 8.5 by 11. Okay. And you can see right away it keeps that 4 by 6 it was at. So we want to make sure our margins are as small as possible. Oh, back in the printer setup, actually, we want to make sure that we don't have... We're going to uncheck borderless printing. That's good if you want to go all the way to the edges, but the problem with borderless is it'll also slightly stretch the image past that and do a slight distortion on it. So for this paper, I'm going to set it to Photo Paper Pro Luster. Print quality is high. Okay. So now you can see it automatically put in the smallest margins that we need. Now we print by 8 by 10, but the opening on my mat that I put over the pictures is actually slightly smaller than 8 by 10. So I'm actually going to size these pictures slightly less than 8 by 10 as well. Okay, so I've went and I've set the height to 9.75 and the width to 7.75 to compensate for the matte that I will have around the picture. We want a little bit of print sharpening, and we'll have that as glossy because it's a semi-gloss photo. So now, as you can see, the picture is actually a little bit bigger than the opening of my matte is, so I'll have to do another kind of resize here. So printing this way, I will be losing a bit of my image, but usually I do my edits with this in mind for this size. Now if I do print at the full 13 by 19 inch that my printer can do, then it will keep the whole picture size. But for this, I'm cropping it down a bit. Alright, so that right there is about where I want it. Now I like to go into printer, check my settings one more time. Photo printing, Pro Luster high. Okay. And then I will send that to the printer. Then here's my confirmation screen. This may vary if you're on a Mac or a PC and what printer you're using. So now we're printing. Alright, so when mounting a photo, there's a few materials I will need besides the photo itself. I can go really in-depth talking about photo mounting, but for today I'll just keep it kind of simple. So the main thing that we're going to need is the photo. We're going to use a matte and a backing board. And then we're going to use acid-free linen tape. Now this is the important thing. If you ever looked at an old photo album, you'll see that some of the old tape that people used to use, maybe like a Scotch tape or painter's tape, you'll see the photo kind of yellows around it because of the acid in the tape. So for this, we're going to make sure we use acid-free linen tape. And then I also just have some acid-free double-sided tape here for sealing the matte to the backing board after I put it all together. So our first step is going to be to create a hinge between the backing board and the matte frame itself. So to start this, I'm just going to cut a few strips of linen tape. Now, a quick note about this tape is they do make tape that you have to put water on to make it adhesive, and they make this tape that has adhesive backing already on it. That's what I use because it's quite a bit easier to use. So we're going to carefully line up the matte and the backing board. Try to get them as even as possible. Now the tricky part with this tape sometimes is getting the backing off. I've seen this done a number of different ways. I've seen it done where people run a strip all the way down it. I typically just do a decent sized strip at the top and the bottom, since usually this gets mounted into a frame then. Now since this is a portrait oriented picture, I could have hinged it at the top, but I still like doing it on the side. Alright, so now we have our hinge there. So now, to actually adhere the picture to the backing board, we have a couple of different options. The most common thing used is what's called a T-hanger, I think is the technical name for it. Now, you could tape directly to the back of the picture. That's not advisable though, because you kind of warp the picture. This is one that I did a while back before I was properly mounting some of my prints. And if you look as I move it around in the light here, you might be able to see a bit of a distortion right in the middle of the picture where I put a piece of tape right there. And that is when I learned that is not the proper way of doing that, and I did a lot more research and I learned the proper way of mounting photos then. The other thing is to notice how much glare is coming off of this picture, and this is part of the reason why I moved away from using glossy papers for most of my prints. I just don't like that reflection. So to make the T-hanger, we're going to use 4 pieces of tape. We'll use 2 that are a little bit smaller. And we're going to use 2 that are a little bit longer. So the idea with this mounting method is that the picture is pretty much going to be freely hung by 2 pieces of tape, and it's going to be allowed to flex as needed within the frame. There's not going to be anything holding the corners down that's going to cause it to buckle or bow. So we're going to take 2 pieces of tape, just kind of fold them over so you're only sticking half the tape to the back of the picture. And being that this is a fabric back tape, it does have a lot of natural flex to it, which is quite nice. So now I'm going to stick these 2 pieces to the top of the picture, just like that. what I'll do is actually align the picture within the matte. So for this type of picture, I probably don't need to worry about fingerprints as much, but I usually end up wearing some gloves just to be careful. I always try to preserve the picture as much as possible. We'll kind of find where the boundaries are. And from with that, I'll move it around slightly till I get it exactly where I want it. They do make photo weights. I don't have any, so I'll usually put a microfiber cloth down and then set something heavy on it. I have this really old 2000s GPS on there. It doesn't really work too well, so I throw that on there. And I'll just double check one more time. So now to finish up the T-hinge, what we'll do, peel off the rest of that. And we'll take another piece of tape and we'll tape over the top of that. And that's what actually holds the picture to the backing board. And now technically we're done. If we wanted to, we could go ahead and leave the picture like that if it was going right into a frame. Since I'm not sure when this picture will be framed, I'm going to go ahead and lay some strips of double-sided tape along the perimeter of the backing board to secure the mat to it, just for storage. And once again, this is all acid-free tape. And I usually have to grab a tweezers to peel this. Just doing a final double check of the alignment. And then we can seal it in. And I use the phrase seal lightly. This can all be taken apart, which is the nice thing about the T-hinge, is if the mat gets damaged, you can remove the picture from it without causing any permanent damage to the picture. Now the final step, of course, is to sign it, which I like using my fancy pen. And there we go. Now usually the last step that I'll do in this is I'll put it inside a plastic protective sleeve for when I deliver it to whoever wanted this picture, or just for storage until I decide to hang it up myself. Thanks again for joining me today, guys. I hope that was helpful, and if you have any questions on how I did any of this, feel free to shoot me a message and I'll be happy to talk more about it. Have a great day and stay warm.